now we can start. I just want to introduce this very interesting conference, and I'm very grateful to all the participants. As you know, primero que nada va a ser toda la conferencia en inglés. Hay una manera de traducir abajo si uno necesita traducción, pero todas las intervenciones van a ser en inglés. Como se indicaba, abajo hay un botón en el cual uno puede elegir y va a haber traducción simultánea al castellano, así que yo voy a seguir ahora en inglés. So Chile is facing a critical moment of institutional design in the drafting of a new constitution. Important aspects are, of course, economic institutions, in particular, central banks' independence, mandate, and policies. For this purpose, we have organized this conference. This conference is not to talk about Chile, it's to learn about the world. In particular, we want to learn from other countries that we used to look like examples of good and well-grounded monetary policy. But also, it's useful to look at a variety of experiences, how they integrate the different components of central bank independence and governance, given their particular political, social, and historical circumstances. It is an honor to have an impressive lineup of great central bankers. I'm very grateful for their willingness and generosity to contribute to this discussion. I understand some of them will not be able to participate in the whole meeting because of other commitments, but we're extremely grateful for their participation. The conference will be divided in two panels. The first on institutional mandates, policy tools, and policy coordination. And the second on democratic accountability, transparency, and communications. If time allows, there will be some questions at the end of each panel. I would like now to introduce the Governor of the Central Bank of Chile, Mario Marcel, who will moderate the first panel. There is no need for presenting him. He is well known for all of us for his long career in public service. And we have had the privilege of having him leading the board of the Central Bank in a very difficult period, with domestic social unrest, the tragedy of the pandemic, and now the resurgence of inflation. The bank has implemented both policies that have decisively contributed to mitigate the effects of these events and navigate in very turbulent waters. So Mario, now, thanks for your participation. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jose. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you. I would like to thank the Faculty of Economics and Administration for organizing this event that would allow us to address these important issues that, as Jose mentioned, are pretty much in the forefront today in Chile, and where, as with many policy and institutional issues, there is a lot of appetite to learn from other countries, not just see what we have, but also to see how things operate elsewhere. It's great to see good friends with whom we have been meeting over the last few years, and including also Jose de Gregorio, with whom we shared a small room as research assistants at CIEPLAN, like I don't know, 30-something years ago. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first panelist, Esther George, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. She holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from Missouri Western State University and a master's in business administration from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She is also a graduate of the American Bankers Association Stonier Graduate School of Banking and the Stanford University Executive Program. She is President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. She has held this job since 2011 and leads a workforce of close to 2,000 employees in Kansas City and its branch offices in Omaha, Denver, and Oklahoma City. The Kansas City Fed is responsible for conducting monetary policy, providing financial services to depository institutions and the U.S. Treasury, supervising nearly 1,000 banking organizations within the 10th Federal Reserve District, a several state region that includes Western Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado, Wyoming, and Northern New Mexico. As the region's representative of the Federal Open Market Committee in Washington, President George participates in monetary policy deliberations and provides a perspective based on 3 decades of experience as a banking supervisor. President George also leads the development of the FedNow service that provides financial institutions with the ability to settle payments in real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And of course, she hosts the annual Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium that is followed everywhere in the world every year. So thank you very much for joining us, Esther, and now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to join you. I want to thank the organizers for including me in this very important issue around central bank independence and our mandates. I don't have to tell this group that history has shown that insulating central banks from the inevitable pressure of political dynamics is an important aspect of achieving economic stability for a country's citizens, even as our domestic priorities support a variety of different institutional frameworks and structures. So today I'm going to focus on central banking in the United States, beginning with some historical context on the Federal Reserve's governance structure and its institutional mandate. I'm also going to talk about the evolution of the Federal Reserve's approach to achieving its mandate. And I'll conclude in that some thoughts on the role of financial stability considerations in the setting of monetary policy. At the time of the Federal Reserve's founding, if you read history, you'll know that the United States had already witnessed 2 unsuccessful attempts at establishing a central bank. The first Bank of the United States, and then its successor, the Second Bank of the United States. And there was intense political debate around the creation of these 2 banks because Americans in general were very skeptical and distrustful about creating such a powerful and centralized institution. And as a result, neither was able to outlast their initial 20-year charters. In the early 1900s, of course, after a series of financial crises, a third effort was launched to establish a central bank. And this time there were 2 overarching themes that emerged during the deliberations about this institution's structure and governance. On one side were those who supported a decentralized structure under the control of the private sector. And on the other side were those who believed that the system should be highly centralized under government control. Eventually, Congress accepted a compromise proposal from President Woodrow Wilson to create a central bank that would have a combined public and private structure, with those roles filled respectively by a board of governors of the Federal Reserve System and the 12 regional reserve banks. As part of that design, the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the monetary policy making body of the Federal Reserve, consists of 12 members. 7 of those members are the board of governors and 5 reserve bank presidents. This unique public-private structure was designed to provide a full representation of national interest in the formulation of monetary policy. And in my own view, the Federal Reserve has been well served by the diversity of views inherent to that unique structure. I also think that the Federal Reserve can best achieve its mandates as an independent agency that makes decisions based on the best available evidence and analysis free of political interference. That is, Congress sets the monetary policy goals for the Federal Reserve, but also gives the central bank independence in achieving those goals. A careful reading of Federal Reserve history, however, will find episodes when the independence of the Federal Reserve was undermined, and that these were often periods when government spending was elevated. Pressure on the Fed to implement policy supportive of government spending actually goes back to the early years of the central bank. During the First and Second World Wars, the Federal Reserve assumed a subservient role to the Treasury and viewed its primary duty as the financing of military requirements and of production for war purposes. The Treasury made decisions on debt management and the interest rate it would pay to investors, and then the Federal Reserve would absorb any public debt that was not purchased by investors at the fixed rate. After World War II, the Federal Reserve became increasingly uncomfortable with this arrangement as inflation started to rise while interest rates remained fixed at a very low level. Eventually, the Federal Reserve's resistance to continually supporting government spending led to a formal accord with the Treasury in 1951. And that accord eliminated the obligation of the Federal Reserve to monetize the debt of the Treasury at a fixed rate. It did not, however, eliminate political pressures on the Fed to hold rates low. And you can look back over time and see a list of events that includes such high-profile instances as pressure from President Lyndon Johnson to hold rates low as a means of supporting his proposals during the Vietnam War, and to calls for the Federal Reserve in the case of Paul Volcker's tenure, when he was asked to resign during the Federal Reserve System's successful but very painful battle against high inflation in the early 1980s. Even so, the Treasury-Fed Accord became essential to the independence of central banking in this country and how monetary policy is pursued by the Federal Reserve today. Let me talk a little bit about the mandate of the Fed, because we operate under a directive from the US Congress that we widely refer to as our dual mandate. And that is to foster economic conditions that achieve stable prices and a maximum level of sustainable employment. That mandate, however, has evolved considerably during the past century. At our founding in 1913, the Federal Reserve's central purpose was to furnish an elastic currency and also to establish a more effective supervision of banking in the United States. By the 1940s, with the Great Depression in mind and the US economy transitioning out of the production of wartime goods, Congress passed the Employment Act of 1946, which called for federal government policy to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. By the 1970s, reports of sustained inflation and high unemployment led to the enactment of the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977. That law explicitly set price stability as a national policy goal, and it directed the Federal Reserve to maintain long-run growth of monetary and credit aggregates that would be commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production, so as to promote the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. In general, the Fed's dual mandate for maximum employment and price stability we consider to be complementary. A strong commitment to price stability reduces fluctuations in economic activity and helps achieve maximum employment and sustainable economic growth in the long run. Occasionally, there are times when those goals, though, are not complementary. For example, the economy saw both high inflation and high unemployment in the 1970s. And not surprisingly, the Fed came under intense political pressure during that period as it weighed the balance between its inflation and employment mandates. As economic conditions have changed over time, so has the conduct of monetary policy. Most recently, in August of 2020, the Federal Reserve concluded a monetary policy framework review that was launched prior to the pandemic. You'll recall the purpose of the review was to reassess how to conduct monetary policy and achieve our dual mandate in a low interest rate environment. In recent years, interest rates had fallen to historically low levels, not just in the United States, of course, but around the world. And these lower rates, at least partially, I think reflect structural changes to the economy, including higher savings by households and businesses in an aging society. And of course, low interest rates can pose a constraint on a central bank's ability to stabilize the economy during an economic downturn. In addition, the link between the pace of economic activity and inflation appears to have weakened. In the years leading up to the pandemic, inflation remained persistently low, even as the unemployment rate neared record lows. This led some to be concerned that persistently low inflation could lead households and businesses to shift down their inflation expectations, which then potentially could set inflation on a downward spiral and further constrain policy space for the central bank. So in response to those kinds of changes, the Federal Reserve revised its monetary policy framework last year along two important dimensions. The first of those was, in the absence of signs of sustained upward pressure on inflation, the FOMC would not tighten its policy stance simply in response to low unemployment rates. The second was that the committee would aim to target an inflation rate that averages 2% over time. And that is, in the case of inflation falling persistently below 2%, the FOMC would allow inflation to run moderately above 2% for a period of time. And here I would note it's important that even with those revisions, monetary policy is conducted by way of a framework rather than a rule. This is important because the structure of the economy evolves over time in ways that can be difficult to anticipate. And so the flexibility of the framework allows the FOMC to adapt to new circumstances and thereby strengthen its credibility. This is certainly true today as the United States economy recovers from an unprecedented shock. With extraordinary fiscal support, as well as potential structural changes to the economy and labor markets stemming from the pandemic, economic dynamics could evolve quite differently now than we've seen in the past. And so the Fed is likely to best maintain its credibility by remaining nimble and attentive to economic conditions as we seek to achieve our dual mandate. Let me talk just briefly about financial stability, because essential to the conduct of monetary policy and the achievement of our mandated objectives is a stable financial system. Prior to the creation of the Fed, US banking panics were a frequent occurrence, and to the founders of the Federal Reserve, the paramount goal was to create a monetary system that could respond effectively to stresses in the banking system, and of course, to serve as a lender of last resort in a banking crisis. Today, you won't find financial stability in the Federal Reserve's statutory mandate, unlike the mandate of others, including the Central Bank of Chile. However, even without a mandate, it is well understood that financial system risk can impede the attainment of the FOMC's objectives for inflation and employment. Particularly in a prolonged low-rate environment, the concern is increased risk appetites and the rise in asset values. And so incorporating financial stability concerns into our monetary policy deliberations can help to build a more resilient system, and I think better achieve our mandated goals. I should say here that identifying financial system risk is, of course, important. It is also difficult, given the constant evolution of our financial system and the associated vulnerabilities. Technological change, financial innovation are introducing new risks that require monitoring. So if you think everything from stable coins to the risk associated with climate change, judging the vulnerabilities that can derail financial stability requires flexibility and nimbleness on the part of central banks. Equally important, I think, is understanding what tools exist to address financial stability concerns. Monetary policy settings are not well suited, in my view, to be the primary tool for maintaining financial stability, although clearly the stance of monetary policy has implications for financial stability. And while macroprudential approaches are desirable in theory, deploying macroprudential policy in a timely and potent manner, at least in the case of the United States, has proved to be very challenging. So let me close by saying, as economies and financial systems evolve, the case for central bank independence, I think, is likely to remain strong. Domestic considerations and priorities undoubtedly will dictate the context and the parameters of that independence, but the benefits of separating decisions regarding the stance of monetary policy from political considerations are likely to serve the long-term interest of governments and their citizens everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esther, for that excellent overview of how the Federal Reserve System works, and particularly how independence is exercised for the achievement of its goals. I think that it was very important that you also provided this historical perspective, because when dealing with institutions, there is a temptation to do a sort of comparative studies, but understanding how you got into the current structure is particularly relevant, especially when, like in Chile, we are discussing a new constitution. One issue that you emphasize, I think, is important to underscore, which is the notion that in order to reconcile or dealing with multiple objectives, working or conducting monetary policy on the basis of a framework rather than a rigid rule is very useful to that end. And perhaps I could add that in the case of the Federal Reserve, that is formally translated into this statement on longer run goals and monetary policy strategy that captured the result of this assessment that you did over the last couple of years. So there is also a formal way of stating how you are going to work, within which framework you will work over the next few years. Okay, so now we can move to the next panelist, Philip Lowe, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. Philip holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree in economics and econometrics with honors from the University of New South Wales. He has authored many papers, including several of them on the linkages between monetary policy and financial stability, which is pretty relevant to our discussion, given that many central banks have these dual objectives. He's a chair of the Reserve Bank Board and Payment System Board and chair of the Council of Financial Regulators. He's a member of the Financial Stability Board. And prior to his current role that he started in 2016, he held the positions of Deputy Governor, Assistant Governor for Economic, and Assistant Governor for Financial System. He's chair of Financial Markets Foundation for Children and a director of the Annika Foundation. He is also chair of the Committee on the Global Financial System of the Bank for International Settlements, where he submits his reports every 2 months when we meet over there. And perhaps I should underscore that for Philip to join us, he's joining at 6:30 in the morning in Australia, and it's 6:30 of October 22nd, who happens to be my birthday. So I could start celebrating with you as we communicate. So Philip, thank you very much for joining us. I think the Australian experience is very interesting to us, given this issue of mandates, and now the floor is yours to present this an overview on Australia as well.
Thank you very much, Mario, and happy birthday for tomorrow, and well, happy birthday for today on this side of the Pacific. It's great to be able to join you, and thank you to both you and Jose for the invitation to participate in what's an important conference you're addressing really critically important issue, and I appreciate the opportunity to share Australia's experience with you. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that there's no single right answer to the issues that you're grappling with. Ultimately, what matters are results, and I think the evidence shows that the probability of a country achieving good results is enhanced if you get the structure around the central bank right. That structure includes the legal mandate of the central bank, the mechanisms for accountability, the way the political system works, and the process for appointing the individuals to the central bank. And the most effective combination of these elements is going to vary from country to country, so there's no single right answer. In Australia's case, the key elements of the central bank mandate were passed into law in 1959, and they've remained unchanged since then. The 1959 legislation set out 3 objectives for the RBA's monetary policy. So we don't have a dual mandate, we have a triple mandate. And the 3 elements of that mandate are, first, the stability of the currency, which is widely interpreted as low and stable inflation. The second element is full employment. And the third element is the economic welfare and prosperity of the Australian people. So it's a very broad mandate. Under this legislation, we've had many different monetary policy regimes. We've had a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar, a fixed exchange rate against a trade-weighted index, an adjustable peg against a trade-weighted index, monetary targeting, and since the early 1990s, flexible inflation targeting. This experience illustrates that legislation is only part of the story, without broad legislation accommodating a very wide variety of monetary policy regimes. In Australia, the choice about the exchange rate regime is one that's made by the government. In my view, that's as it should be, as the choice of exchange rate regime has very wide-ranging implications for how a country's economic system works. In our case, the decision by the government to float the Australian dollar in 1983 has helped reshape the Australian economy in a very positive fashion. The floating exchange rate has also proven to be a great stabiliser of our economy, particularly in the face of large swings in our terms of trade caused by sometimes very large movements in commodity prices, an issue that Chile shares with us. While the Australian government determines the exchange rate regime, it's the RBA that makes decisions about intervention in the market. We rarely intervene, and we are transparent regarding the conditions under which we would intervene. In particular, we would only intervene if market liquidity is significantly deteriorated during a period of stress, or the exchange rate has moved a long way from fundamentals with damaging consequences to the economy. The last time the RBA intervened in the foreign exchange market was during the global financial crisis, so more than 13 years ago. So intervention is very unusual, and I'd say becoming increasingly unusual. We do not have an objective for the exchange rate, nor would it make sense for us to do so. In my view, adding an exchange rate objective to the central bank's other objectives would severely compromise the achievement of those other objectives and produce, on average, poorer results. Turning now to the inflation objective, Australia was an early adopter of flexible medium-term inflation targeting. From the outset, our target has been for the CPI inflation rate to average between 2% and 3% over time. We focused on the medium term rather than the outcome in a particular year or the outcome over a specific forecast horizon. We never bought into the idea that the central bank needed to be placed in a straitjacket or surrounded by an electric fence to stop it from exploiting the short-run Phillips curve. We've always had a flexible approach that allows for some variation in inflation from year to year. While financial markets are often very concerned about whether inflation in a given year is 1.7% or 2.3%, most people in the real economy rightly don't focus too much on this. Most of us have better things to worry about. What matters for overall welfare is that people are confident their savings and their income will not be eaten away by inflation. It's also important that saving and investment decisions can be made without inflation figuring prominently on people's radar screens. There are various ways of achieving this, but we have found a flexible medium-term inflation target works well. In terms of the formalities, Australia's inflation target is not set out in legislation. It was originally set by the central bank, but soon after this, it was codified in a written agreement between the central bank and the government. The agreement is reviewed whenever there is a change of government or a change in the central bank governor. Over the 25 years since the first agreement was signed, the language has evolved considerably, but the numerical target of 2 to 3% on average has been maintained, and so too has the focus on the medium term. From my perspective, this arrangement has a couple of advantages. First, it enhances the credibility of the monetary policy regime as it demonstrates that the inflation target is owned by both the government and the central bank. Second, it offers a degree of flexibility as the target is not set in stone. The target and the accompanying language can be changed if both the central bank and the government agree. As we've seen in Australia, the language can change over time. The other elements of the RBA's mandate are full employment and the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia. In terms of full employment, we do not have a numerical target, and I don't think it makes sense to do so. Experience has taught us that the Nauru moves over time, and it's influenced by many factors outside the control of the central bank. I think the same can be said for the estimate of the employment to population ratio that's consistent with full employment and stable inflation. Setting the wrong targets here would create a conflict with the inflation target, which would lead to monetary policy uncertainty and poor economic outcomes. Despite the difficulty of setting a numerical target here, I'm a strong supporter of the RBA's broad mandate, as I said, which includes not just full employment, but also the economic prosperity of the people of Australia. And I say this from two perspectives. The first relates to communication. I see a benefit in the central bank being able to communicate that it cares about more than just inflation control. To be clear, inflation control is and always needs to be at the core of what a central bank does. But ultimately, inflation control is only a means to an end. And that end is a productive economy with people enjoying economic and financial stability, having jobs, and achieving a high level of economic welfare. Having a broad mandate allows the central bank to pursue and articulate its goals in these broader terms. This can help build trust in the central bank over time and support public confidence in its decisions. That's not to say that a broad mandate is required for the central bank to speak in these terms, but I think it makes it easier to do so. The second perspective is that a broad mandate can provide an extra degree of freedom in responding to economic shocks. This is especially so in the case of supply shocks, when output and inflation move in different directions. A broad mandate can allow the central bank more time to return inflation to target following shocks that push inflation away from target. Provided that the inflation target's credible, this flexibility can be used in a way that does not prejudice the achievement of medium-term price stability. Importantly, the flexibility can help reduce the amplitude of cycles in activity and employment, and it can also have the benefit of reducing financial stability risks, especially if cutting interest rates in response to a positive supply shock and lower inflation encourages excessive borrowing and asset overvaluation. Again, I want to make it clear that the central bank does not need a broad mandate to have this flexibility. It's possible that a central bank with an inflation-only mandate could achieve the same results, especially if it has a flexible rather than a rigid inflation target. The other topic for this session was the coordination arrangements with the government. I've already spoken about the agreement on the inflation target, so I'd like to touch on 4 other aspects of the relationship between the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Australian government. First, The government appoints all members of the Reserve Bank Board, which is the decision-making body for monetary policy. The governor has a 7-year term and often serves a longer term. Other board members are appointed for at least 5 years, and they often serve multiple terms. Beside the governor and the deputy governor, all members of the board are external to the central bank, and they're prominent members of the business, academic, or policy communities. The secretary to the Australian Treasury, who's the most senior public servant in the Treasury Department, is also a full voting member of the board. The secretary participates as an economist in their own right, not as a representative of the government, but he or she is able to share details of the government's fiscal and other plans. The board is apolitical, and there is not a tradition of board members stepping down following a change of government. Board members, including me, can have their appointments terminated only if they become permanently incapacitated, become bankrupt, miss too many meetings, or fail to satisfy their obligations regarding the governance of a public sector entity. These termination provisions have never been used, and they're not a point of controversy. Second, there is a frequent exchange of views between the central bank and the treasurer as the representative of the government. This exchange is mostly on an informal basis as circumstances require. The treasurer does not attend meetings of the board, nor has the right to do so. The government and the opposition both support the independence of the central bank. And when the government is asked about monetary policy, the typical response is that monetary policy is a matter for the independent Reserve Bank, and the government doesn't offer its own comment. Third, the RBA is the transactional banker for the Australian government. In that role, it provides the government with a small overdraft facility that can be used only to deal with unexpected mismatches in the timing of government payments and receipts. While there's nothing in Australia's central bank law that prevents lending to the government, there is a long-standing written agreement that the central bank will not provide such finance. Furthermore, the government has no role to play in the RBA's decisions about its bond purchase program. These decisions are taken independently by the RBA's board. Fourth, the Reserve Bank Act includes provisions for dealing with a situation in which there is a fundamental difference of opinion between the government and the central bank. In such a circumstance, the law states that the central bank is required to set out its position in writing. The government could then order the bank to adopt a particular policy. If the government did this, it would then need to set out all the relevant documents before both houses of parliament within 15 sitting days. So there'd be a very high level of transparency about what was going on. I want to point out that these provisions have never been used. They effectively operate as a safeguard against the possibility of the independent central bank pursuing a policy that would be damaging to the national interest. In my view, there is a strong case for such a safeguard in a parliamentary democracy, especially one in which there is both a focus on institutions being accountable to the parliament and a long tradition of political respect for policy-making institutions. Exercising this power would be a very major political step, and it would draw strong interest from the media and from financial markets. So it's not something that would be done lightly. As I said, it's never been done. At its core, the relationship between the government and the central bank in Australia is one based on constructive dialogue. This is reflected in the agreement regarding the inflation target I spoke about earlier, and the frequent discussions on issues of mutual interest. The government also supports a high level of transparency by the RBA, including through publications and speeches and public appearances before parliamentary oversight committees. I want to finish, Mario, where I started, and that is that there is no right answer to the questions that Chile is grappling with. But Australia's experience is that a combination of a freely floating exchange rate a flexible medium-term inflation target, and a broad mandate for the central bank can work well for a small, open economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. I think that you addressed a very, the whole spectrum of institutional dimensions of the Federal Reserve Board, but also giving a sense of what things are more frequently used, or those that are statutory but have not been used in history. So when you're discussing a constitution or a framework legislation, that is an important part of the picture. Things that actually are more binding, and others that are only for very exceptional circumstances that may not be generated. And I think that the point that you made at the very beginning, that the same framework can be home to different rules is very important. Our policy regimes, you said, because that's the nature of a constitution, to provide a broader framework, but the policy has to develop within that, and the policy regime is the way of providing a structure to those policy decisions. Okay, so now we turn to Alejandro Diaz de Leon, the governor of the Bank of Mexico. Alejandro has a master's degree in public and private administration from the Yale School of Management, specializing in financial engineering and valuation of derivative and fixed income instruments. He has developed an extensive professional career linked to the Bank of Mexico since '91, working in areas such as the Securities Market Studies Subdivision, Financial System Analysis Subdivision, Macro Financial Analysis, Macro Analysis, and Economic Studies. In 2007, he was appointed as a General Director of the National Pension Fund for Workers in the government. He was head of the Debt Management Office at the Ministry of Finance and General Director of the National Bank of Foreign Trade. In addition, Alejandro is the author of several publications published by the Bank of Mexico and other institutions, has participated in many collegiate bodies in developing banking and financial authorities. He was appointed by Mexico's president to serve as governor of the Bank of Mexico from December 1st, 2017. Alejandro, the floor is yours to share your experience and your institutional structure for the central bank in Mexico. Please go
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mario and Jose, for the invitation. It is an honor, and thank you to the Universidad de Chile for being part of this conference. Central banks are unique institutions. They all share the responsibility of providing our countries with national currency, and money is an essential public good that needs to be an effective medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. Societies have found that the best form of money is not that which provides intrinsic value, but that which, although immaterial, fiat money, given the rules and strategies followed by its issuer, ensures the issuer's commitment to pursue society's long-term goals. The mandate, goals, and objectives defined by society for central banks determine the strategies and terms and conditions by which they provide money to their national economies. This clearly represents an issue of sovereignty and social contract of utmost importance. Countries may set different priorities to take specific elements into consideration. To a certain extent, central bank mandates are usually influenced by the most adverse monetary episodes previously experienced by each country. For example, Germany's in the 1920s hyperinflation must have influenced their society's search for price stability, as the Great Depression may have raised employment consideration in the US Federal Reserve's dual mandate. In the case of many central banks in Latin America, between the late 70s and early 90s, many economies in the region experienced periods of high inflation. Since that time, Concerns have been that central banks under political influence tend to set expansionary policies to finance governments and stimulate short-term economic growth, regardless of the medium and long-run consequences. This was the main reason why it was necessary to isolate monetary policy making from direct political influence. Many central banks in Latin America and in other regions were thus granted independence, with mandates set mainly on pursuing price stability. In this context, Chile was one of the first economies to modernize its monetary policy framework with this objective. Central bank independence requires an institutional setup that sometimes involves making political, unpopular decisions, but which are intended for the long-run benefit of the country. Its key features are, first, a clear legal mandate and specific objectives. Second, limiting the government's discretionary power of appointing central bank governing board members. 3, limiting the ability of any government authority to use central bank as a source of financing. 4, consolidate collegiate decision-making bodies with proven technical capacity and the guarantee to act independently. And 5th, allowing the central bank to choose the best means to achieve the objectives set by law. The paradigm of autonomous, flexible inflation targeting central banks was the result of society's recognition at that time that the central bank's best contribution to long-term growth was to maintain sustained price stability, and that monetary policy should deliver long-run inflation around a specific defined target with non-persistent fluctuations in inflation. This clearly recognizes the notion that there is no exploitable trade-off between inflation and real variables. Even though most central banks have price stability mandates, the sharp contractions in economic activity experienced during the global financial crisis and the current COVID-19 pandemic have led to the revision of the adequate monetary policy mandate and also some of the frameworks. Theoretically, economic models point unequivocally towards optimal monetary policy strategies that minimize fluctuations around inflation target and around the potential output. The key question is which central bank institutional framework, mindful of political economy considerations, delivers such outcome. In this regard, when an economy faces inflationary pressures from aggregate demand, monetary authorities with a single or dual mandate operate to stabilize inflation and output gaps. However, more challenging scenarios in which these gaps move in opposite directions may take place. In this context, central banks would face a complex trade-off regardless of their mandates. Under a dual mandate, these institutions are likely to face strong pressure to prioritize economic activity concerns in spite of the presence of a positive inflation gap. As an example, the ECB, whose primary objective is to maintain price stability in the euro area when facing supply-related disturbances, conducts monetary policy aimed at achieving a gradual and orderly convergence of inflation to its target while avoiding a sharp fall in economic activity and employment. In advanced economies, inflation dynamics are better anchored around their targets, and they are mainly driven by aggregate demand dynamics. Under these conditions, a dual mandate could be regarded as a useful way to explain the central bank's reaction function. Emerging economies face additional challenges. First, while they have strengthened their macroeconomic policy frameworks and improved their economic fundamentals over the last decades, and despite their great advances in controlling inflation, many of them have not fully consolidated an environment of low and stable inflation, and medium and long-term inflation expectations are not fully anchored at the target. Monetary policies is still in the process of attaining these goals. Second, emerging economies face larger and more frequent inflationary shocks, and thus have historically registered higher inflation levels and expectations higher to bring back to target. 3, they are predominantly small open economies whose terms of trade are strongly influenced by commodity prices. They are also open to capital flows and thus subject to variation in investor sentiment and global risk aversion. For these reasons, they are highly exposed to fluctuations in global economic and financial conditions, which in turn is reflected in a large exchange rate volatility and in frequent inflationary shocks. Moreover, consumer price indices in these economies have larger weights on the prices of volatile items such as food and energy. As a result, inflation is on average more volatile and more difficult to forecast than in advanced economies. To illustrate this point, let me highlight that recent research done at Banco de Mexico suggests that on average, shocks to the output gap have explained only about 10% of the variation of core inflation across Latin American countries since the early 2000s. On the other hand, exchange rate shocks account for almost 24% of the variation. Idiosyncratic inflationary shocks originating from government authorized prices, weather factors, and so on account for more than 60%, and commodity price shocks account for the remaining variation. When there are insufficiently credible inflation targets and inflation dynamics is dominated by foreign exchange and supply-related shocks, a well-defined and broadly understood and communicated single mandate can better contribute to reduce uncertainty about the central bank's reaction function and reduce term premium. In this case, the central bank can commit to a low and stable inflation around its target while avoiding spillovers on economic activity and employment. For emerging economies, facing these conditions and adopting a dual mandate could require a tighter monetary policy stance to compensate for the added uncertainty in the reaction function and its effect on both inflation and term premium. When central banks in emerging economies face a complex policy trade-off because inflation and output gaps are moving in opposite directions, they have to ensure that monetary policy does not lead to increases in term premia and induce a steeper yield curve. In this circumstance, a dual mandate could add that uncertainty to the policy response and put pressure on inflation risk premium. Under these conditions, emerging economies could be better served by a well-defined single mandate centered on price stability to directly contain inflation expectations and risk premium. There is an additional challenge faced by emerging economies, especially in Latin America, where there is a significant economic growth deficit that over the last decade has resulted in a lower per capita GDP relative to other emerging and advanced economies. Even in the case of Mexico, we have seen a reduction of potential GDP over the last years. In this environment, political pressures seeking to have stimulus and higher growth will not be put to rest by an update of potential GDP that it is a non-observable variable. Thus, in these economies, central banks are bound to face greater pressures to put aside long-term price stability concerns and provide a short-term stimulus to the economy. Summing up, under the current setting, an institutional mandate that is attainable, time-consistent, and allows society to make policymakers accountable for their actions by having them build credibility in their commitment to their goals is fundamental. In the specific case of Mexico, monetary policy has been conducted to achieve a primary price stability mandate. This approach has led to direct benefits such as lower inflation, lower exchange rate pass-through, stable inflation expectations, and lower term premia, and indirectly to other beneficial changes in the economy, such as the development of long-term financial instruments. It is important to underline that a central bank by itself cannot achieve macroeconomic stability. Coordination and communication between both monetary and fiscal policies is crucial to achieve success, and Mexico has had a successful experience cooperating with the Treasury. Of utmost importance is that this approach has allowed Banco de Mexico to remain a strong public institution and sustain its independence with legitimacy in the eyes of the public. In this regard, central banks, especially in emerging economies, must also play the role of an anchor, both in economic and institutional frameworks, and with a clear, attainable mandate that contributes to strengthen these institutions. Overall, while the ultimate goal of any central bank is and must be to contribute to the welfare of society, there is no unique institutional design that fits all economies at all times. Authorities and legislators have to consider multiple elements based on the historical experience of each country, the nature of the shocks faced by their economies, and any other likely pressures that institutions may face under diverse circumstances. In sum, long-term oriented institutions, including central banks, now more than ever need to be designed thoughtfully, and particularly must have a clear, time-consistent mandate that allows for good decision-making for the benefit of our societies. Thank you very much, Mario.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I think your presentation was particularly useful to us as coming from an emerging economy in our same region. And you raised a very important point, which is that one should think of mandates and institutional frameworks that are consistent with the structural nature of the economy. So when we usually say that there is no one size fits all, in the case of emerging economies, that means taking into account that our relationship with the outside world on issues like dependence or the impact of terms of trade, capital flows, and so on, are very important. So that's something that one should keep in mind in looking at comparing institutions across countries. Okay, we have a couple of minutes left. I know that we are very close to the allotted time for this panel, but I think that Dean De Gregorio may have a question for you, taken from the ones that came from the audience. But I would ask you to keep short in the answers so as not to eat time from the next panel. So
yes, I think
yes.
that the most important issue today, and most of people is asking everywhere, is what your view on the challenges of monetary policy and central banking facing this inflationary shock as we are living the pandemic. So I think that it's quite a first order issue in monetary policy today around the world. So if you can tell us something about your views, and well, views that later on we'll know from your central bank decisions. So I don't know if some of the Esther?
I'll just be very brief, Jose. So certainly we have spent how many of the past decades where the public didn't think about inflation. Inflation was low and stable. Central bankers were paying more attention to, at least in the case of the US, trying to make sure inflation was hitting their 2% inflation targets. And you contrast that today, where now we have the public quite attentive to the levels of inflation that are coming out of this recovery with labor shortages and supply constraints, and central banks trying to refocus people on the long run as opposed to the short run. So it is a very challenging time in judging what is a near-term issue as it relates to inflation versus a long-term issue. And at the same time, not wanting to take our eye off is what is a central mandate for us, and that is making sure that we achieve price stability over the long run. So indeed challenging, and something my colleagues and I are spending a lot of time, both in a communication standpoint, as well as assessing the risk to the long run outlook for the economy.
Thank you very much. Alejandro, Filipos, do you want to say?
Yes. I would just say very quickly, this is a very peculiar shock that we are facing. This is not the traditional supply shock. I think the pandemic is a very peculiar shock, that it is introducing not only these bottleneck issues on the supply side, but also a significant shift from expenditure, from consumer expenditures, household expenditure, towards durable goods. So we are spending all less in services and more on durable goods. How long will that shift in demand will take to process? How the price dynamics that will be? I think that is an open challenge. We are of the view that the shocks are to be transitory. Nonetheless, the risk for inflation have increased. The policy space, as in the fiscal side and the monetary side, something similar. Emerging markets, we have significantly less space than advanced economies. We have not had inflation below our targets for the last 20 years or so. So in our case, we have to be more mindful about price formation and the contamination of inflation expectations. And that's why we have been, I would say, trying to reduce monetary accommodation already as a way to improve our chances of having an orderly adjustment and not having inflation expectations being contaminated.
Thank you very much, Alejandro.
Thank you, and I agree very much with Esther's assessment. I mean, we're clearly seeing a spike in inflation at the moment, and broadly we understand why that spike's occurring. Whether the spike turns into a permanent lift is going to depend really what happens in the labour market. Because I don't think we're going to have sustainably higher inflation unless we have sustainably higher wages growth. And that's, for me, where the big open question is at the moment. How are the labour markets and wage growth going to respond to the spike in inflation? Is it going to reset expectations about what type of wage growth people should get? Or will the spike dissipate and we'll go back to the type of labour market outcomes we were seeing before the pandemic? So there's quite a lot of uncertainty around that issue. So that's what we're watching very carefully.
Thank you very much, Phil. So I think that now it's time we can move to the second panel. And we have to realize how generous has been our participants, because the ones that in the Western Hem have been more lucky with the time. But for Phil, it's already, I think that it's 7 a.m. and in South Africa, Germany, is about 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. in Israel. So I'm really grateful. Now, the only thing that we were very lucky is that given this timing was very difficult to say, I cannot go because I have another meeting. So that was a good thing. Now, let me just move to this second panel on democratic accountability, transparency, and communication. And we'll start with Karnit Flu. Karnit is a former governor of the Bank of Israel. She received her MA cum laude in economics from Hebrew University, and then her PhD in economics from Columbia University. Karnit joined the Israel Democracy Institute as its Vice President of Research and William Davidson Senior Fellow for Economic Policy. Karnit previously served as Deputy Governor and Acting Governor of the Bank of Israel. She also developed an extensive career in the Research Department of the Bank of Israel. Karnit joined the International Monetary Fund and worked also at the IDB as an economist, and she has served on a number of public and government committees, including the Committee of Increasing Competitiveness in the Economy, the Committee for Social and Economic Change, the Committee for Defense Budget, and the Committee to Study Raising the Retirement Age of Women. So she has a lot of experience, not only in central banking, but also in the whole range of monetary policies. So please, Karnit, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jose, and I'm very happy to be here, although it's 11 o'clock at night, but I didn't have to fly 25 hours, so that's a bonus. My comments here are based on my experience with the Bank of Israel law, which was revised actually in 2010, and it was a revision that benefited from the experience of central banks in advanced economies over the years, and in particular during and since the global financial crisis. But I also want to say a few words on the basis of what I learned about the Central Bank of Chile. And you didn't mention that I was on the committee of external evaluation of the Central Bank of Chile in 2019. So I have a few words to say about that. So I'll discuss briefly the question of independence, mandate, and accountability of central banks. As was already discussed in the previous panel, it's broadly recognized that the short-term horizon of politicians create an inflation bias resulting from the natural tendency to prefer policies that support higher growth or employment in the face of a heating economy, and that would lead to higher inflation. The recognition of this intrinsic bias led to the broad support for independent central banks that focus on achieving price stability, most frequently within a flexible inflation target. But what do we mean when we talk about the independence of a central bank? Generally, it means that central banks has at its disposal the complete set of instruments to achieve its mandate and the freedom to use them. And the freedom to use them also mean the absence of political interference, including by the threat of removal from office, for example. In the Bank of Israel law, this is reflected in the chapter that states, and I quote here, to attain the objectives and perform its functions, the bank shall be autonomous in choosing its actions and exercising its powers. Thus, the bank may issue securities of the bank, perform on the stock exchange or in other regulated market or off market, an action on or transaction of any kind, and I'll not go through all of them, receive deposits from banking corporations under conditions set by the MPC, grant credit to banking corporations, again, under conditions determined by the MPC, and under exceptional circumstances, when the committee is of the opinion that there exists a genuine threat to the stability or orderly activity of the financial system, grant credit also to financial entities that are not banking corporations. Thus, the bank is autonomous in determining its broad range of policy tools and how to use them to achieve its objectives. It also has broad powers in gathering information needed to perform its tasks. The independence of the Bank of Israel is also reflected in the very extreme circumstances under which the governor can be removed from office. The president of the state may, per motion of the government, terminate the term in office of the governor if it deems that the governor is unfit to continue his term in office, or for one of the following reasons: committing an act unbefitting of his status as governor, violating provisions that ensure against conflict of interest, or permanent incapacity. So there are very extreme circumstances under which a board member or governor can be removed from office. Let me move now to the question of the policy objectives and mandates. The mandates of a modern central bank include price stability as the primary target, and with some cases where price stability is one leg of a dual mandate, as in the case of the Federal Reserve. In most central banks, the level of activity or employment is specified as a secondary target. In addition, most central banks' law assign the central bank also a supporting role in safeguarding financial stability. While price stability target includes a numerical definition, the employment or output target are always referred to qualitatively, aiming at higher or stable level, in recognition that the central bank policies in these areas can play only a supportive role, affecting aggregate demand, but these outcomes are also strongly affected by structural policies that are at the hands of governments. For a central bank to be able to aim at meeting the targets, they need to be clear, coherent, achievable, and consistent. And when the economy is subject to a demand shock, there is no trade-off in pursuing the two targets. Expansionary monetary policy will work towards achieving price stability and maximum employment if there is an adverse demand shock. While contractionary monetary policy will work towards achieving the two targets if there is a positive demand shock. Things get, of course, more complicated when we face a supply shock, which may cause prices to go up while demand goes down and reduces employment. In such cases, the trade-off do arise among the targets, and there is a need to apply judgment in designing monetary policy that weighs the relative risk of achieving each of the targets and to balance out the weights of these risks in designing policy. The main objectives of the Bank of Israel are listed and prioritized in the law: to maintain price stability, to support other objectives of the government of the government economic policy, especially growth, employment, and reducing social gaps, as long as price stability is achieved over the course of time, and supporting the stability of the financial system. The government is the one that sets the specific numerical inflation target in consultation with the Bank of Israel. I should comment that the Bank of Israel does not have, like other central banks, within its toolkits, direct tools to affect the social gaps. However, given that unlike other central banks, the governor of the Bank of Israel is also the economic advisor to the government, issues of social gaps and income distribution are studied and recommendations are made by the Bank of Israel in this area. Let me move now to the issue of accountability. And the question is, how can unelected officials be accountable for their actions? So the high level of independence comes with the requirement for high degree of accountability, which can be achieved by transparency and effective communication. These are important to gain the support and the trust of the public for central banks' policies conducted by unelected officials. In the Bank of Israel law, specific publication and reporting requirements to the government and to the Knesset, our parliament, by the Monetary Policy Committee are defined, including monetary policy report that is issued twice a year and summarizes the deliberation and resolutions and reasoning behind the resolutions, and also numerical results of the voting and the resolutions are published with the monetary policy decisions. Also, an additional requirement in the law is that if the inflation rate deviates during 6 consecutive months from the range determined by the government, a special report needs to be issued explaining how actually how the policy will bring inflation back to the target range. And the government and the Knesset may at any time demand the bank to present them with a report on any matter relating to the activities of the bank in any of its functions. Gaining the support and trust of the public means also that central banks should be attentive to the side effects of its policies on outcomes that are outside its mandate and that it does not necessarily have the tools to directly affect. Issues like social gaps can be affected by central bank policies in various ways. Its expansionary policy can lead to higher employment, thus higher labor income that tends to favor the poor, and thus improving income distribution, while at the same time it can affect asset prices, thus increasing wealth concentration. Although central bank policies even out over the cycle and thus over the long run, these effects may be quite small, it's important to study them given the research capability of the bank and the public interest in those results. Another issue of public concern is climate change. Here also central banks is not a major player, but considering such issues in its investment policy would be a way to be attentive to such concerns. Now I'd like to make just a few brief comments that are more specific regarding the Central Bank of Chile on the importance of maintaining its independence and clear and coherent and consistent achievable mandate. Again, based on my experience in the External Evaluating Committee. The first conclusion of our committee was that the conduct of monetary policy in Chile over the last 20 years with flexible inflation targeting regime and floating exchange rate had served the country well. Chile's macro monetary policy management has been exemplary for emerging market standards, and it has been able to keep medium-term inflation expectations anchored around 3%. So I think that the independence of the Central Bank of Chile that is enshrined in the current constitution should be strictly guarded. This means that board members should be free to follow policies without the threat of being removed from office if politicians are unhappy with some of their actions. The toolkit of the Central Bank of Chile is generally adequate, and the change that was introduced in 2020, which allows it to purchase government bonds in the secondary market under some circumstances, under extreme circumstances, is a welcome addition that brings the toolkit now in line with those that are at the disposal of central banks in advanced economies. That was something that we commented in our report on, and I was very happy to see that that was actually changed. Its single price stability mandate could be expanded to include employment and high level of activity as a secondary mandate, as it would define de jure what the central bank has already been aiming at de facto. This may justify sometimes lengthening the horizon and bringing inflation back to the target if it would serve to advance the employment target. The Central Bank of Chile is accountable by being very transparent about its policies and about the considerations behind them. It also had been on its own initiative inviting periodically external evaluations so as to provide the public with an independent assessment of its performance and constantly improve its capability in line with the evolving experience at the most advanced central banks. So I think in all of these areas, it shows its accountability to the public about its actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karnit. I think that was very useful, and also I think that for all the discussion that's coming in Chile, it's quite important to also give your report to the Constitutional Assembly and have a discussion on your findings. It was quite an interesting work. I think that there are two things. It was quite interesting what you say, that you have the obligation in Israel of supporting the government policies. And I would like to know that, to say that in Chile, although we can say Chile is a country with price and financial stability, one could say, well, so they cannot have a flexible inflation target because the flexible inflation target looks at unemployment. But I think that there is and this is a discussion that I had when I was at the central bank. In the law of the central bank, it said that the central bank must follow consistent policies with the long-term goals of the government. So there is also, I would say, implicit the same spirit of saying the well-being of the people, as in the case of Australia, or the long-term goals of the government. And I think that today, and it's related to the previous discussion on inflation, is about this kind of trade-off between responses to demand shocks. When there are demand shocks, of course, inflation goes down, employment goes up, so it's kind of everything consistent. It's different when there are supply shocks. And as Alejandro said, it depends a lot on persistency. Because if it is transitory, it's not a change in the full employment output. If it is permanent, there is an effect on what we would understand with full employment output. So I think that is and especially today in the discussion, because in the world regarding the response of monetary policy, which in the case of Chile, just to make sure, because there are a lot of Chileans here, in the case of Chile, there is also a big difference. We have a huge demand shock. Output this year will grow, according to the central bank, that is almost always right, will grow at about 11% this year because of a huge fiscal expansion, massive historically, and also because of the withdrawal of savings in the pension funds accounts, which is already goes at 30%. So it has been. Thank you very much, Carney. Now we'll continue with Valerie Herzberg. She's the president and chief executive officer of the Federal Reserve. Sorry, she's the, because I had was a late moment problem. She has a master. She's in the Bundesbank, and she also is I haven't messed with your because I just received a, sorry, this is, it always happens, but I will do the right presentation because I received your first, here it is. Yeah, she's a deputy director. I'm very sorry, but this was my mistake taking care of so many last time details. But Valerie is the Deputy Director General of Financial Stability of the Deutsche Bundesbank. Valerie has a master's MSc in economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Since September 2021, she is the Deputy Director General of Financial Stability at the Bundesbank. Before, she was the head of the international relations of the Central Bank of Ireland. Previously, she was member of the cabinet of Vice President Jiri Katainen and member of the cabinet of Herman Van Rompuy, President of the European Council. Her focus is on economic questions, including notably the Eurozone. Previously, she works at the IMF European Department, at the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, the National Bank of Belgium, and the Bank of England. So we're very grateful for your contribution, and please, and thank you very much for being so late. My mistake. You may think that here is so late also because of my mistake. That's not the case. So thank you very much, Valerie, for being here.
No worries. Well, thank you for inviting me and allowing me to contribute to this really very interesting panel on democratic accountability, transparency, and communication. So obviously, there's a very important topic given the many mandates and roles central banks perform. And we've heard a lot about that already. And I think, recent crises like the global financial crisis, the euro area crisis, and now the pandemic have solicited central banks in unprecedented manners and pushing them to develop new tools and instruments to achieve their mandates. And they're also asked to contribute to the handling of global societal changes, such as climate change. So not surprisingly, their footprint in the economy is increasing markedly. And of course, this increased footprint then also requires commensurate accountability. And one of the tools, and it's mentioned already, is of course enhanced communication to support that. So in my remarks now, I'd like to focus on the financial stability and the financial oversight nexus, and to discuss these two aspects. I mean, the first one, independence. The second one, accountability and the challenge of effective communication. And then I'd like to close my remarks with some thoughts on the role of climate change, because this is quite a tricky issue, I think, we have to grapple with. So starting off with independence. So let's start with the legal perspective. And I know the Bundesbank is always very much, looked at on that issue. So for the Bundesbank, central bank independence is guaranteed by European Union law and national law. On the union level, Article 130 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union shields the European Central Bank and the national central banks of the European system of central banks from instructions from third parties, in particular from European Union institutions and national governments. And this, of course, applies to the common, the common policy, which is monetary policy. In addition, on the national level, Section 12 of the Bundesbank Act codifies the Bundesbank's independence from the German federal government for all tasks conferred to the Bundesbank. So for financial stability in particular and supervision. But beyond the legal aspects, I think there is the governance that is important, and it's been mentioned here already, and I can only reiterate that. I mean, strong arrangements there underpin independence. I think the first is the nomination process. The nomination process and the term of office of the governing body play an important role in securing independence. In the Bundesbank, for example, the members of the executive board are appointed by the president of the Federal Republic, nominated either by the federal government or by the upper house. So the current vice president responsible for financial stability, for example, is directly nominated by the federal government. So I think it's important that the nomination actually comes from the highest level of government and not from the Ministry of Finance. And in Europe, this is actually not the case everywhere. Then there is a length of office. And so the longer, the better. In Germany, the board members are nominated typically for 8 years and can only be removed for serious misconduct or if they don't fulfill the conditions required to perform their duties. And I think like in Australia, as we've heard, this has never happened before. So it is clearly, there's a, I asked the lawyers today, you know, what actually would need to happen. And they gave me all these sort of particular circumstances. But at the end side, this is of course all very academic because it hasn't really happened before. So let's look a bit more closely at independence in the context of financial stability and financial oversight mandates. Because obviously these mandates have become, you know, more important in recent years. So most central banks in the world have financial stability mandates. That is a commitment to preserve financial intermediation in good and in bad times. So a study covering 82 jurisdictions sheds light on the institutional design, and it shows that central banks are the primary authority in macroprudential policy for close to 60% of surveyed jurisdiction. And 2/3 of these jurisdictions assign banking supervision to central banks as well. But because of a more diffuse mandate, and because sometimes these are shared competences, and there's a more direct relationship also with the private sector, I think the concept of independence is actually quite complex. And I'll look at these three issues, these three factors now in turn. So first of all, the relationship with the private sector. So I think what is important is not just independence from the government, but also from private sector interests. Independence of supervisors is, for example, one of the pillars of the Basel Committee's core principles for effective banking supervision. In addition, of course, within supervisory agencies, mechanisms need to ensure that there are no revolving doors and that supervisors rotate to prevent them from aligning their interests with the supervised institutions, i.e. that they just get too close to their clients. So this was actually one of the reasons for setting up the single supervisory mechanism in the euro area, to basically create this distance between supervisors and their local banks. And empirical work on the functioning of the single supervisory mechanism indicates that there are indeed differences in supervisory practices at the national and supranational level, with national supervisors tending towards being more lenient. So a second aspect that differs from the monetary stability mandate is the sharing of competencies. So central banks sometimes perform supervisory and oversight roles in cooperation with other agencies. So in Germany, for example, banking supervision is carried out by the Bundesbank together with the European Central Bank and the National Microprudential Supervisor, the BaFin. So broadly speaking, the Bundesbank performs on-site supervision and the analysis of risks at the bank level, while the ECB and the BaFin are in charge of the prudential assessment and supervisory action. Turning now to financial stability, as in many other jurisdictions, the Bundesbank has a mandate in analyzing risks to financial stability and in proposing warnings and recommendations. But when it comes to macroprudential action, the relevant authority in Germany is the BaFin, which is accountable to the Ministry of Finance. It's actually yes, it is accountable to the Ministry of Finance. So this recognizes, of course, the societal and distributional effects of these policies, but it creates other challenges, as we shall see. Important to note that this model is not the norm in Europe, and there's different ways of arranging supervision and financial stability mandates. So with shared mandates and financial stability, two issues I think become important. I think first of all, a common understanding of what the mandate actually means. So we don't directly measure financial stability. So there will always be significant debate and uncertainty about the right course of actions. It's a new policy area. We don't know all the transmission mechanisms. So agreeing on what should happen. So should capital buffers go up or down? This will always be subject to much debate. But I think there's a more deeper issue, which also needs to, where a common understanding is really desirable. It's to have a similar understanding of what the mandate actually means. So what does actually stability mean? Does it mean preventing bank failures at all cost and preventing no change in the financial sector? Probably not. Does it mean ensuring that the financial system does not exacerbate economic swings by restricting credit to protect capital when under pressure? Probably yes. But there's a big gray area in these various interpretations. So being on the same wavelength on these fundamental issues is really crucial when you have a shared mandate in order to tackle constructively the challenging assessments that then follow later on when you have to make decisions. The second issue is effective communication on financial stability. So the central bank is accountable as regards its assessment of financial stability risk. But how do you make yourself heard when you're actually not the institution that takes the macroprudential decision? And also, how can you be effective if different bodies that share a mandate convey different messages, or if there's a risk that these messages be perceived as different, or if there's slight nuances? And of course, this requires then a lot of coordination, and it goes back to having a similar view and having a similar understanding. But of course, it makes the communication of what you're trying to achieve much harder. But I think even when analysis and action is in one hand, in one body, in one central bank, say, it's actually not a topic of much interest to the public at large. Unless there is a financial crisis actually occurring, and then you don't really need you don't really need anybody to warn about future risks because the risk is actually materializing. But financial cycles are much longer than economic cycles, and so central banks are often accused of crying wolf for long periods of time when no risk materializes, and that risks then undermining their credibility. Now, of course, if you have a recent history of financial turmoil in your jurisdiction, then it helps being heard. So I worked in Ireland before. Financial stability, they had the financial crisis about 10 years ago. So it is much easier to communicate about the risks emerging from a financial sector than in Germany, which hasn't had a financial crisis for a very long time. So while in Germany, inflation is a topic that interests everybody all the time, the financial cycle is not. So can layering of communication help? This is sort of the view that you streamline your message to different audiences. And the Bank of England has done quite a lot of work on that in making messages accessible to the non-expert citizen to use, plain English, for example, and to get involved with citizen dialogues in schools, universities. And actually, I think it's not just important from an educational perspective, but it's also important to ensure that future talents are interested in a career in these public institutions. So what about accountability for central banks that actually have macroprudential policies, have macroprudential powers? So can set capital ratios, for example. So this is, of course, a very important issue because these measures aimed at increasing resilience of borrowers also have a direct impact on who has access to credit and how much and at what price. And this can have very significant distributional effects. So central banks are therefore required to, those central banks are therefore required to explain on a very regular basis their action in front of parliamentary committees. And their analysis is no longer just ex ante in terms of warning about risks, but it's also very importantly to evaluate their actions and to explain what the effects were of their policies, and to disseminate, these results. And so, for example, the questions, were households more robust to withstand a shock after mortgage measures were introduced, is a very important one, because some of these households, may not have gotten credit. But it gives also then the fiscal authority the possibility to correct any unintended consequences. And I think it's one of the way round of some of the independence criticism that might be directed at central banks that have such powers. So the last 2 minutes now, I'd like to say a few words about the new challenge, not a new challenge, but anyway, climate change. It's a bit of a transgression, but I think it's something where some of these issues become quite relevant and create new of new relevance. So it's clearly a key challenge for today's societies, and central banks, as part of society's institutional infrastructure, cannot stand on the sidelines. At the same time, and we've heard that many times, central bank activities are bound by their mandates, and that's of course right. So it raises the question: what can they do, and what should they do to address climate-related challenges? So maybe let's start off by looking at what do they already do. A survey conducted by the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, the NGFS, shows that 1/4 of all mandates of central banks comprise specific provisions to support sustainable economic development. And I think some of you are in that nexus. And this is certainly the case of the European Central Bank, which has a secondary mandate to support European Union policies. But at the same time, it's typically not, of course, the primary concern. While price stability and financial stability are in the area of responsibility of central banks, the objective of climate stability is of course not. So this leaves us with the question of what central banks can do within their mandates. So of course, price stability is a prerequisite, and as climate change affects economies, it affects inflation, and there's a risk of more volatile inflation, distorting price signals. And so it's obviously something that needs to be taken into consideration by a central bank. But second, and this was already alluded to, central banks are large organizations which have a big balance sheet. They're engaged in risk and asset management and have operational activities. And they need to follow the same environmental and climate standards that apply to the private sector. And so, and as it affects climate change affects the value and the risk profile of their asset holdings, just like for other financial institutions, they need to incorporate these risks into their risk management. And so disclosure of these results, I think, and of their carbon footprint is important to maintain the bond of trust between increasingly climate conscious citizens and their central bank. And the Bank of England, again, disclosed as one of the first the results of their carbon footprint not too long ago. And thirdly, so central banks need to substantially improve, I think, their analytical tools and data infrastructure to develop, especially stress tests in the financial sector. And this is very challenging. Classical macroeconomic models, which we typically use, on the monetary policy side, they're not suitable for addressing the relevant climate-related questions. They need to capture the considerable uncertainties, the very long time horizons, and the very broad spectrum of possible pathways for the economy. So it's important to consider multiple scenarios, correlations between economic and climate variables under different policy assumptions. So the Bundesbank will shortly publish its climate stress tests of the financial sector in the November Financial Stability Report. And I tell you, going through these, reading, understanding what actually goes on in these stress tests is very, very complicated because of these multiple dimensions. But I think that's the key to for the central banks to make a really important contributions for then also the financial sector to be incorporating these sort of stress tests in their own analysis. So finally, a broader point maybe on climate. Climate policies can also benefit, I think, from the insights gained from the history of central bank independence itself. Creating independent institutions can help to address issues of time inconsistencies and the risk of policy reversals due to electoral cycles. And climate policy is, of course, one of those policies where these risks are very present, and we see that every day. So let me conclude. So my first point is strong governance arrangements are key to secure independence, both from the government, but also from the private interests. And I think this is especially true when it comes to financial sector mandates. My second point is about shared mandates and financial stability. They have advantages, but they also create significant challenges from an accountability and a communication point of view, especially because it's a relatively new field of economic policy with many unknowns still. So that is making it, that doesn't make it easier. And lastly, I think central banks can provide very useful analysis and insights to support the economy in its transition to a more CO2 efficient world. And by being transparent about their own carbon footprint, they can also strengthen the bond of trust with citizens. So thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Valerie. It's been quite useful also to bring because we used to say that central banks only care about price stability, but it's quite interesting because all central banks also care about financial stability, and it has become much more important since the global financial crisis. But as you say, it's quite difficult to communicate. It's quite difficult to communicate the risk to the population at large, saying there are risks in the financial system. It requires a lot of financial literacy. So it is a quite important issue, and also it brings, as you say, a lot of governance and institutional issues about the other agencies that are in charge of these, the relation with the government that's not necessarily the same as the infrastructure that we have for price stability that just the central bank. So this is, I think, a quite important issue for discussion and also for central bank design. So thank you very much. Now, our last panelist will be Lesetia Kganyago, the governor of the South African Reserve Bank. Governor Kganyago holds a Master of Science in Economics from SOAS University of London, a Bachelor of Commerce degree on accounting from the University of South Africa. He also received various training in finance, economic, and management. He's the chairperson of the Monetary Policy Committee and the Financial Stability Committee. Prior to his appointment as governor, Mr. Kganyago served as deputy governor of the South African Reserve Bank. He also chairs the Committee of Central Bank Governors of the Southern African Development Community, co-chairs the Financial Stability Board's Regional Consultative Group of Sub-Saharan Africa, and chairs the Financial Stability Board's Standing Committee on Standards and Implementation. In addition, until recently, he served as the chairperson of the International Monetary and Financial Committee, which is the primary advisory board to the International Monetary Fund Board of Governors, and was Director General of the National Treasury. Thanks for being with us. The floor is yours, Governor Kganyago.
Thank you very much, Jose. And being the last speaker and with the limited time that is left, I had to figure out what value I am now going to to bring after so many colleagues talked about this subject. And so I thought then I would look at basically two things that I would share with you. Firstly, the economics, which you will all already be familiar with, that has to do with central bank independence and to some extent the accountability. And then I would like to spend some time sharing with you the South African legislative experience in terms of the independence of the central bank, and then close it there. The stuff on the economics that I'm going to share with you draws extensively from a lecture that I gave at the Peterson Institute in 2019. And basically, from what colleagues on the panel were saying, draws from basically the textbook case on central bank independence, which centers around the well-known time inconsistency problem. It's an elegant analysis, but it only covers a narrow part of central banking. Central bank mandates have evolved. This time inconsistency problem was in essence dealing with the price stability mandate of central banks, and as such, when the mandate expanded in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, although some central banks had been responsible for the supervision of banks, it is really in the aftermath of the global financial crisis that most central banks started to have very explicit financial stability mandates. But the time inconsistency problem does not, that framework does not help us much when it comes to the issues of financial stability. The issue of central bank independence thus goes further, and it begs the question: if you say that there is a time inconsistency problem, and thus you should have an independent institution that will then deal with the execution of particular policy outcomes, and this institution is run by technocrats who are not elected, how is the accountability actually taking place? Again, the economic literature helps us, and the framework is that of the principal and agent problem. And we know the question that we then face is how can societies get their leaders to look after the public interest instead of their short-term political interest. This is one of the fundamental difficulties of government, and in my experience, it has also been the main reason South African Reserve Bank has needed its independence. Independence has allowed us to deliver on our mandate as set out in the Constitution. And this mandate can be in primary legislation, but we deemed it fit in South Africa that it should actually be captured in the Constitution. And the reason was very simple. If you have to change legislation, you can change it by a simple majority in Parliament. To change the Constitution, you need a higher threshold. And in our case, you need 2/3 majority of Parliament. But there is an additional hurdle. And that hurdle is that if there is a constitutional amendment, the constitutional amendment have to be certified by the Constitutional Court to be consistent with the constitutional principles that we adopted when we adopted the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. And so, with independent institutions run by technocrats, with a mandate that is spelled out, you could then say that central banks have a contract with the society that we serve. And as such, that contract has got to be spelled out, and it's got to be clear what is expected of central banks. So in our case, our mandate is spelled out in the Constitution, and the Constitution does not go very far. In the Constitution, you only have about 3 clauses that deals with the central bank. And it goes and it says, the South African Reserve Bank shall be the central bank of the Republic of South Africa, and that its primary object is the protection of the value of the currency in the interests of balanced and sustainable growth. And so when I had colleagues talk about the prosperity of society, about full employment, about maximum employment, and so forth, the authors of our Constitution captured that. The primary object is price stability, because price stability is a necessary condition. And it might not be sufficient, but it's a necessary condition for balanced and sustainable growth. So the central bank does not have a mandate for growth or for employment, but it is almost an implied mandate that what the central bank does is in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. So we have got a price stability mandate. Interestingly is that the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa then goes further. And here comes the trick. It says that the South African Reserve Bank shall do such other things as are ordinarily done by other central banks. So when you think of it, any politician can say that the Central Bank of Australia is doing this, therefore you must do it. The Central Bank of Chile is doing this, therefore you must do it. But the way in which the clause is framed, which says ordinarily done, that means you have got to make a case to say this is a trend in central banking. But our Constitution goes further and says those other things that are ordinarily done by other central banks and you ask the central bank to do must be captured in a national piece of legislation and can only be subordinate to the primary mandate of the central bank. So our responsibility for the payment system is captured in a legislation. Our responsibility for prudential regulation of the financial sector is captured in a different legislation, but it is clear with all of this legislation that they are subject to the primary object of the South African Reserve Bank. And so the Constitution captures the mandate, and then it says that in pursuit of that mandate, the central bank must act independently and without fear, favor, or prejudice. And so a legislation that thus gives the responsibility to the central bank and gives the detail to this is the central bank legislation itself. And interestingly, in South Africa, is that the central bank legislation predates the Constitution. And so it almost had to be retrofitted. After the adoption of the Constitution, we had to make amendments to the legislation to make it consistent with the Constitution. So when Kenneth was talking about the governor in Israel is the advisor to the government, our legislation used to say that the central bank is an economic advisor to the government. And interestingly, when that responsibility was removed, it was almost like, call it an anger by the politicians. You are going to act independently. You can't also be our advisor. You can go and act independently. And we were quite happy as the central bank to say, you can have that as your responsibility. But then the Constitution then says, there must be regular consultations between the Minister of Finance and the South African Reserve Bank. It doesn't say that the Minister of Finance sets the responsibility. Interestingly is that neither the central bank legislation nor the Constitution spells out exactly what the price stability mandate is. In other words, neither the legislation nor the constitution sets a numerical target for price stability. So what that the lawyers interpreted it as is that the Reserve Bank must spell out what the price stability, quantifying the price stability mandate should be. But the central bank decided that as we were introducing inflation target 21 years ago, that the correct thing to do is to actually get the entire government to buy into the inflation targeting framework. And as such, the inflation target was thus agreed by the Minister of Finance and the central bank. Of course, if the Minister of Finance wanted a different inflation target, he would have to convince the central bank for that. And the central bank, in terms of the framing of the constitution, could say, no, that is not quite what price stability is. Now, of course, all of these things with placing of all these responsibilities raises very important issues of accountability and how you appoint all of these technocrats that are unelected and have got this massive power that could actually affect society. The governor and the deputy governors are appointed in terms of the Central Bank's Act, and the Central Bank Act provides for the appointment of 15 directors. We have got an interesting setup because we still have private shareholders. So out of the 15 directors, 7 are elected by the shareholders, and the 8 are appointed by the president. In those 8, 4 being the executives, the governor and the 3 deputy governors, which are appointed by the president, and all that the president has to do is to show that he had consulted with the board of the Reserve Bank before he makes the appointment, and that the board has expressed a view as to the fitness and propriety of the people that are being appointed as governor and deputy governors. Interestingly, is that the central bank legislation provides that there should be consultation with the Minister of Finance, and our own jurisprudence has set up these things, but it doesn't say that it is after. It says it's after consultation, not in consultation with. And our own courts interpreted it as the president can consult, but it is still his decision. And that if it was in consultation with, it would have required the concurrence of the Minister of Finance. And so it doesn't require the concurrence of the Minister of Finance. Which then brings me to the next issue of then, if the appointments are done by the president, how would governors be removed and under what circumstances would they be removed? The bank is a creature of the Constitution, and the removal of the governor from office is quite a complex one. There is security of tenure, which is a key consideration. It has allowed the governor the opportunity and space to conduct monetary policy without fear, favor, or prejudice. And our own courts have basically interpreted it as the one who appoints is also the one who can remove. But in having to remove a governor, 2 tests have got to be put. It's got to be shown that the governor or the deputy governors have been rendered unsuitable if the government, including parliament or any other party, can take legal action to have the governor declared unfit to hold office. The governor and the deputies serve as directors of the central bank, and as such, they are bound by rules which demand that they remain fit and proper to serve. And in terms of the act, fit and proper entails 1, avoiding conflicts of interest between personal interests and the interests of the central bank, and secondly, not working for a bank. So if the incumbent falls short of these requirements, there is recourse to taking legal action against them. Interestingly, because the actual targets in terms of the mandate are not set up in the Act, there is nothing in the Act thus which would provide to say that if the central bank has not met its inflation target, these are the consequences. What had so happened though is that through a public agreement, which was done through an exchange of letters, the Minister of Finance, by the Minister of Finance and the central bank, if the central bank has not met the inflation target, it must explain publicly why the target has not been met and over what period would the target thus be met again. The setup here is such that there is security of tenure. So if the government changes, you can't say there is a new government, I want my own governor. You will have to wait for the term of the governor to actually be finished. We account to Parliament through their parliamentary committees. We are not being called to Parliament as much as we would like to. We would have preferred a much more interaction with Parliament. And interestingly, the law just says that Parliament can ask us to appear. It doesn't spell out how many times we appear in Parliament. And that is a flaw because it means that the engagement with Parliament is actually limited and not what it is supposed to be. But what about the public at large? Accountability and transparency are the other side of independence. And if we are to protect the independence of central banks, we have got to be accountable. We have got to be transparent in the manner in which we govern the institutions, in the manner in which we execute our mandate. And we must then have to account for the decisions we make. And communication is important. So we had broadened our own engagement with the public through various engagements. We have got what are called monetary policy forums, which we take to every province in the country. We run a monetary policy schools challenge where we get the schools to participate in a competition of some sort. So we have got a very interesting public outreach program. That has taken me to 15 minutes, Josh, and maybe then it is time that I bring this to the close and say that central bank independence is very important and for the economic reasons that had been spelled out, that many of us have talked about, being the time inconsistency problem. But we must understand that with independence comes accountability. And if anyone doubts whether we need central bank independence, just wait until you don't have it, and then you will know what it actually means. And the experience elsewhere in the world with central banks that are not independent leaves much to be desired. And secondly, that the accountability mechanisms, yes, we account to parliaments or Congress in your case. That is not the totality of accountability. We actually need to be reaching out to the public much more broadly so that we actually demystify this creature that is central bank independence. And lastly, just to reiterate what Valerie said, when it comes to the financial stability mandates, the picture gets blurred and it becomes difficult, and you actually need the ministries of finance to be on board. And lastly is that central banks have been very successful in the price stability mandate. We have been successful in the execution of the financial stability mandate. My fear is that society has got an elevated expectations of what these institutions can do, and we might end up being piled with more and more responsibilities that the institutions are actually not designed to execute, and therein would lie the risk of our failure.
Thank you very much, Governor Canyajo. And I think that I just want to leave with your to have a very interesting discussion about the law, constitution, how to change and the mandates. But I just want to close with what you say at the end, which is, and I will kind of interpret, central banks have been so successful in fulfilling their mandates that now there will be the temptation for adding much more objectives because it is a successful institution. So I think that is, and that's, I think that there is a bit of an inconsistency on that way to think about central banking, because precisely because they have a narrow focus and specialized with all the caveats that you have made in this conference. I think that is because they have been so successful around the world. So I think that Mario has been checking at the tons of questions and we're very close to the end. So perhaps you can pick one, I don't know, Mario, to.
Yes, thank you very much, Jose. Earlier on, I referred to my birthday, but there is an anniversary that is far more important with us, which is the 100th anniversary of the Reserve Bank of South Africa. So congratulations, Governor Kaniago, for that. Of the many questions that we have received, there are several of them that refer to cryptocurrencies and central bank digital money. So perhaps we could focus on that particular issue, especially drawing from the point that Lesetia made at the end. I mean, all central banks, in addition to these mandates that have been quoted throughout the conference, are also given the monopoly of issuing fiat money. But now with the changing technology, there are, on the one hand, there are cryptocurrencies that are being generated in the private sector, and many central banks are working on the possibility of issuing central bank digital currencies. But to connect with the topic of this meeting, I wonder, how do you see that relating to the mandates and governance of central banks? In the case of central bank digital currencies, that may involve opening bank accounts for millions of people, for instance. So how much could central bank independence be consistent with a mission like that as compared to other alternatives, and what are the kind of risks that may be involved in that? So that would be my one and only question. There are a few more, but I trust that the faculty could summarize them and perhaps including the publication that they're planning to do with this conference. So focusing on digital currencies and governance, I don't know, Karnit, Valerie, Lesetia. Yes, Karnit?
Okay. I will actually, maybe we can think first about what are the potential motivations for central banks to actually issue digital currencies. And I think only when there are a lot of risks associated with issuing digital currencies. But I think if we find that only if we find that there are sufficient potential benefits, that may outweigh in some way the risks. So I think that digital currencies could be a competitive alternative to the existing means of payments. They can encourage innovation in the world of payments and adapting the payment system to the needs of the expanding digital economy, increasing the redundancy of payment systems and its resilience against failures. It can reduce the cost of making cross-border payments. It can have the balance between maintaining the possibility of privacy when making digital payments, as long as payments are made lawfully, but it can also support the government's policies against the shadow economy. So I think that we tend to, as central bankers, we tend to focus on the risks, and there are a lot of risks in actually issuing central bank digital currencies. But maybe when you look at all these motivations, that at some point they may actually be, when you look at them together, maybe each one of them would not be sufficient to justify going this route. But when you look at all of them together, these motivations may actually at some point in the future tip the scale in favor of actually moving forward in issuing these currencies. So.
Thank you, Karen.
You want me to?
Yes, Valerie.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts on central bank digital currencies. It's obviously, also in Europe, a very big topic. I mean, the European Central Bank has now started a 2-year process of evaluating a possible introduction. And of course, as you can imagine, in the context of the Euro area, where you have 19 jurisdictions with very different financial systems and setups, the questions of design, and it goes to your question of, how does it affect the whole governance of central banks, is of course is a very tricky one. I mean, only the question of whether you want a retail or a wholesale CBDC, you have very different interests in the euro area, because you just have very different types of financial sectors and setups. But I think from our perspective, it is important that the central bank does not become the the market, but that there is a market that delivers payments, and that this market functions well, and that there is competition, etc. Now, of course, I think, and Karen had mentioned, I mean, there is many benefits that one needs to also consider, and I think the issue of the cross-border dimension and making sure that payments can travel freely, that these systems are compatible with each other. I think that's a big concern of us as well. And Germany will have the G7 presidency next year, and it's one of the things regarding central bank digital currencies that we want to keep in mind. As everybody looks at their own way of setting it up, it is really important that these systems are compatible with each other, and that we don't find ourselves later on in a world where there's sort of stumbling blocks that need to overcome. And I think for Chile, the whole question of remittances is an important one when it comes to a central bank digital currency and ensuring that works smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Lesetia?
Thanks, Mario. I mean, we are on a learning journey on the central bank digital currency. I mean, a close look could say that in the wholesale market, what we are running with payment systems are basically digital currencies, and that the focus now is on what do you do with retail and what would this actually mean. We are participating and sharing these experiences with many central banks. We are busy with our own review and study about how this could work alongside physical currency. It is going to be a tricky one, and I'm glad that people now are focused on the central bank digital currency, because the question I always get is about the crypto assets, and I think that as a central bank community, this is going to continue to be a challenge for us, and we'll have to continue to share experiences about how we think this thing could be introduced if it ends up being introduced.
Thank you very much, Leseti. And finally, from my side, given that in this panel we have been discussing communication, I wanted to place an ad on our book that was just launched yesterday on independence, credibility, and communication of central banking. That is that includes all the papers from the conference that we made on this subject 2 years ago. So there will be here you will find a number of studies that relate to precisely to the subject that we are addressing. We have been addressing in this panel. So back to you, Jose.
Thank you very much. We're time to close. I think that some people in Europe and South Africa, they may be very next to sleep and well, feel Nexus are working. We're extremely grateful for your help. It has been quite important, the discussion. As we are quite interested, we want to thank our media partners, La Tercera, Cooperativa, the radio. They have transmitted this. We will keep posted these presentations. We plan also to have them by written and in Spanish to distribute especially to the people that trust in the Constitution. I think that has been extremely useful. It shows that there are kind of some key features that we share, but also the details and the institutions of that country are different. And what's kind of is important is to take the good ideas and to put them in the context of the institutions of the country. I think that has been extremely a useful discussion. We're just starting in Chile with the discussion, but I think that overall, I want also to congratulate for your work and this oftentimes of the pandemic in financial stability, in providing stimulus. So I think that it has been a great having you here, and just to end, we're very grateful again. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the participants and people that has been here in this event on live. So thank you very much. It's been great to see you, although on a virtual way. Next time we'll have dinner somewhere.
A great day or evening, depending on where you are.
Yeah,
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.